$6 million, 4 years. 11 engineers brought in from Detroit, Stuttgart, and twice from a consultancy outside Tokyo. And still the 1969 Dodge Charger RT sat in the center bay of that climate-controlled garage, like something beautiful and deliberately wrong, its hemi-orange paint catching the overhead lights the way embers catch wind. All surface heat, no flame underneath. Cordelia Ashton had learned not to look at it directly, not because it hurt less. It didn't. But because looking at it required her to feel things she had spent 4 years carefully reorganizing herself around not feeling. And she was a busy woman with a company to run and a board that expected her undivided attention. Her father had bought the car the spring she graduated from Vanderbilt. He was 63, retired from 31 years at the steel mill in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and he had been researching that specific car, 1969 Charger RT, 426 Hemi, the one with the flying buttress rear window, since Cordelia was in elementary school. He kept a folder on his kitchen table, clippings, printouts from early internet forums, notes in his handwriting that started as lists and ended as small essays about horsepower ratings and production numbers, and what Hemi Orange looked like in person versus photographs. He paid $60,000 for it, more money than Walter Ashton had ever spent on anything in his life. He called Cordelia that evening, and she could hear in his voice something that had no name in the vocabulary of retirement and mild health problems and a roof that needed fixing. A boy's voice in a 63-year-old man's chest, pure and without apology. He drove it home from the seller's lot in Columbus. That was the only time anyone drove it. He kept it in his garage under a car cover. He smoothed and retucked every other day, the way some people tend gardens. He talked about a road trip to Gatlinburg in the fall when the leaves were turning. He never took it. He died 18 months later, coronary, at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in March while Cordelia was in Chicago for a conference. She had the car transported to her estate outside Nashville the month after the funeral. She prepared a bay for it. Temperature controlled, good lighting, gray epoxy on the floor. She told herself she would get it running. That was the word she used privately in the hours after the service when everyone had gone home and she was sitting alone in her father's kitchen with his folder of clippings and his mug still in the drying rack. She would get it running. The car had never run right since he bought it. The previous owner had retrofitted it with an aftermarket electronic fuel management system sometime in the 90s. Common for muscle cars of that era, an upgrade meant to make them more drivable. It hadn't worked properly even then, and the previous owner never sorted it out, and Walter had bought it anyway, convinced he would find someone to fix it, and then he had died before finding anyone. The first team came from Nashville. 4 technicians, modern equipment, strong credentials. They spent 3 days and left a report that used the phrase intermittent fault 7 times in 14 pages. The second team came from Detroit. The third from a specialty restoration shop in Phoenix that charged twice as much as anyone else and was supposed to be the best in the country. They weren't. Or rather, they were excellent at everything except this particular thing. 11 teams over 4 years. $6 million, which was not a meaningful sum to Cordelia in any practical sense. She ran a pharmaceutical company with a market capitalization in the billions, but which had become, in the private accounting she kept of her own failures, a measure of a specific helplessness she had not known she was capable of feeling. The car would not run. Every diagnostic came back clean, which was itself the problem, because something was obviously wrong, and the tools kept missing it. The 11th team's lead specialist, a man named Dr. Preuss from a restoration consultancy in Dusseldorf, had been closer than anyone. 14 days on the car, he called her himself when he hit his limit, rather than hiding it in a billing statement. "The fault is present," he said on the phone. "I am certain of this, but where it lives inside this system. I cannot tell you. I am sorry." She paid him double, thanked him, and stood in the empty garage for 20 minutes after his van left the property. Then she drove to Orin. She wasn't sure afterward why she went. She had passed through that town on the way to her lake cabin a dozen times and had noticed the garage on the main road. 2 bays, hand-painted sign above the door that said Rourke's in dark green letters, the way you notice things without really registering them. She wasn't looking for a mechanic. She was just driving because the house felt wrong that afternoon. too large and too silent. She pulled up at 2:30. The bay doors were open. An old Silverado sat on the lift with its exhaust half disassembled. A man was underneath it, lying on a creeper, just his work boots visible from the entrance. From somewhere deeper in the garage, a child's voice was asking whether dinosaurs had been larger than the Silverado. Probably, the man said from under the truck. Some of them. How much bigger? Depends on the dinosaur. A pause. I think a Brachiosaurus could step on it. I think you're probably right. Cordelia stood at the edge of the bay. The child, a girl, maybe 8 or 9, sitting on a stool with a sketchbook open across her knees, looked up first. She had dark hair in a lopsided ponytail and paint on 3 of her fingers that didn't match anything in the garage. "Hi," the girl said. "Hi, is your father here?" "That's him," the girl said, nodding at the boots. "Dad, someone's here." The man rolled out from under the truck. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, with a face that had been worn by time and work rather than worry. He wore a gray shirt with Beckett stitched above the pocket in red thread. He had grease on his forearm that he didn't bother looking at as he sat up. He looked at Cordelia. She looked at him. "I have a 1969 Charger RT," she said. 4 years, 11 teams. Nobody can find what's wrong with it." He didn't look impressed or skeptical or curious in a performing way. He just looked at her, steadily, the way people look when they are actually listening rather than composing their response. "What's the issue?" he said. "Electrical. It won't start. Diagnostics read clean, but something in the fuel management system keeps aborting the start sequence. Nobody can locate the origin point." Something moved across his face, quick and almost imperceptible. A door opening somewhere inside him that had been closed for a while. "Aftermarket EFI retrofit," he said. "From the 90s? "Yes." He was quiet a moment. His daughter had gone back to her sketchbook, but was watching him from the corner of her eye, the way children watch a parent when something has quietly shifted. "I can take a look," he said, "no promises." "Everyone I've brought in has said that," Cordelia told him. He nodded once, like that was fair. He arrived at the estate at 6:15 on a Saturday morning, earlier than she'd expected. Ruth, the housekeeper, texted Cordelia before she was dressed. "The mechanic is here. He has his daughter with him. The girl is eating a biscuit." Cordelia came down to find the bay lights already on, just the work lights above the Charger, and a small LED lamp Beckett had clipped to the front bumper. He was standing beside the open hood with his hands in his pockets, not touching anything, just looking. Ada was in the corner, with her sketchbook, on a folding chair she had carried from somewhere, her feet swinging 6 inches above the floor. He didn't hear Cordelia come in. He was too focused on the engine bay, his eyes moving slowly across the wiring, the way you read something difficult in a second language, carefully, without rushing. "You're early," she said. He glanced back. He didn't apologize. "Light's better before 7. She stayed. She told herself it was only for a few minutes. She had watched 11 teams work on that car at various points and had formed impressions of all of them. The Nashville crew worked fast and talked too much. Dr. Pruce worked slowly and said almost nothing. Several in between projected competence the way insecure people project confidence, loudly and in the wrong direction. Beckett worked differently than any of them. He didn't run diagnostics first. He didn't pull up reference material. He traced the wiring harness by hand, section by section, 2 fingers moving along the cables the way you might read something in the dark. He lifted panels and looked at what was underneath them. He lay on his back under the dashboard for close to 40 minutes without moving. At one point, Ada held up her sketchbook to show Cordelia a drawing. The Charger, roughly, with a large horned dinosaur beside it for scale. "The dinosaur is bigger," Ada said. "It is," Cordelia agreed. "I made it a Carnotaurus. They had horns. Most people don't know that." "I didn't." "It's okay," Ada said, and went back to drawing with the uncomplicated grace of a child who has accepted that she knows more about certain things than most adults and has decided not to hold it against them. Cordelia brought coffee at 8. Beckett took it without looking up from the wiring he was tracing. He said, "Thank you the way people say it when they mean it and are not performing gratitude." Ada asked for orange juice, then amended this to orange juice if there is any, then added please with the slight stiffness of a child who has been reminded about please recently, enough that it's still a conscious addition. Ruth brought juice. Ada said thank you with considerably more warmth. Ruth appeared to find this pleasing. By noon, Beckett had said nothing about what he'd found. Cordelia asked once. Not sure yet, he said. He didn't elaborate. With the previous teams, elaborate language had usually been a sign of someone who was uncertain and covering it. His silence felt like something else. It felt like precision. She left him with Ruth checking in, and Ada, who had by that point graduated from the sketchbook to a chapter book she'd pulled from her backpack, reading in the folding chair with her feet tucked under her, and the focused composure of someone accustomed to long hours in garages and who had prepared for exactly this. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. 3 Saturdays, each time arriving before the light changed, Ada in the passenger seat with a new book and a growing series of drawings documenting the vehicles at Rourke's garage compared to various dinosaurs. The Charger appeared in every installment alongside the Carnotaurus. She had decided, she told Ruth, that they had similar energy. On the 4th Saturday, Cordelia was in the kitchen at 6:40 when she heard it. Not the quiet clink of tools or the low murmur of a man thinking in a register below language. Something different, something her body recognized before her mind did. The engine turned over once, then twice. Then the 426 Hemi came to life with a sound that was less like a car starting and more like something waking up after a very long sleep. Deep and physical, and without apology, exactly the way her father had once tried to describe it to her from a printout when she was 11 years old, and she had nodded without understanding what he meant. She understood now. She was out of the kitchen before she fully decided to move. Beckett was standing to the left of the car with his arms crossed, watching the engine run with the expression of a man who has fixed something that mattered and understands that the fix belongs to the car, not to him. There was satisfaction in his face, not triumph. The quieter thing, the relief of a person who held a problem steady for 4 Saturdays and did not let go. Ada stood in the side doorway in her socks, chapter book under her arm, hair still compressed from sleeping against the truck window on the drive over. She looked at her father. "You did it," she said. "It's running," he said, careful about the tense. Cordelia hadn't moved from the doorway. She was aware that her face was doing something she couldn't regulate. Something connected to the idle of the engine and the smell of oil and exhaust, and the particular way that vibration came up through the floor and into the soles of her feet and to a kitchen table in Middlesbrough, and a folder of clippings, and a mug in a drying rack, and a phone call she'd taken in a hotel corridor in Chicago on a Tuesday morning when the world changed its shape permanently. She was crying, the unmanaged kind, the kind that doesn't check whether the moment is appropriate. Beckett looked at her once. He didn't move toward her or say anything reassuring or perform the discomfort that most people perform when someone else's grief arrives, without warning in a room. He simply turned back to the running engine and let her have the moment entirely without crowding it, without trying to resolve it. Ada withdrew to her folding chair with the careful instinct of a child, raised to understand that certain moments belong to other people, and the kindest thing you can do is give them space to be in them. Ruth, appearing in the side doorway, pressed both hands over her mouth and stood very still. The Charger idled. The garage was warm. Cordelia stood in it until the crying stopped, which took longer than she expected, and then she pressed the heels of her hands over her eyes and breathed. "I'm sorry," she said. Beckett didn't look up. "Don't be." She walked to the driver's side, put her palm flat against the roof. The paint was warm, Hemi orange. The color her father had described from a printout when she was 11. He said it was the color of something that didn't apologize for existing. "How did you find it?" she asked. He came around to stand beside her and pointed to a section of wiring harness along the firewall where a dense bundle of cables met a bracket that was not part of the original car. "The EFI retrofit," he said. "Whoever installed it in the 90s, they knew what they were doing, mostly. But the integration point here, where the aftermarket system communicates with the original ignition timing hardware, they used a ground path that was never properly speaked for this engine environment." He traced the harness without touching it. 40-something years of heat cycling, The insulation degraded in a very specific way. Not a clean break, not a short, just enough resistance change at operating temperature to confuse the ECU. The system reads it as a sensor error and aborts the start sequence to protect itself. Every team ran diagnostics looking for a clean fault, Cordelia said. There isn't one. You have to look at how the whole system behaves, not at individual readings. He straightened. The behavior was consistent every time. That means the cause is in one location, doing one thing. Once I understood what it was doing, finding where was just time. She looked at him. Beckett, how do you know this particular failure mode? He was quiet a moment, the quiet of a person deciding how much of a longer answer to offer. I used to work in powertrain systems engineering, he said, for a company out of Michigan that developed electrical integration components for the restoration and performance market, among others. He looked at the harness. This specific retrofit system, I worked on its successor. I wrote a service bulletin about this failure mode 15 years ago. She was very still. You wrote the documentation that describes exactly what was wrong with this car. I wrote documentation about what went wrong with cars that came after this one. Same mechanism, different decade. He paused. Finding it here still took 4 Saturdays. $6 million, she said slowly. 11 specialists. He didn't respond to that directly. The other teams were working from each other's reports. By the 5th or 6th team, everyone was searching places already searched. A pause. Also, none of them had written the service bulletin. She laughed, short and involuntary, surprised out of her. It felt strange in her chest, the way laughter does when it arrives on the back of crying. 2 different instruments playing in the same small room at the same time. Why are you running a 2-bay garage in Orin? She asked. She said it without cruelty. Something shifted in his face, older than defensiveness. The fatigue of a version of this question he'd already had with himself many times in the quiet hours after Ada was asleep. My wife died when Ada was 2, he said. A car accident. He said it plainly, without protective arrangement, without softening the edges. She died. Ada needed someone present. What I was doing before, it required travel, required a part of you to always be somewhere else even when you were home. He looked at the charger. I needed to be where I was. The shop let me be where I was. Ada's voice came from the corner. Dad, is it fixed? It's running, he said, same as before. She appeared from behind her folding chair, book under her arm, and walked over to stand beside Cordelia. She studied the engine compartment with the practical appraisal of a child who has spent a considerable amount of time in garages. It sounds different than the trucks, she said. Different engine, Beckett said. I like it. She looked up at Cordelia. My dad is really good at finding things other people can't find. He found my retainer twice. Once it was inside my shoe. I have no explanation for that, Beckett said. It was inside the shoe, Ada said. That is the explanation. He looked briefly at the ceiling with the expression of a parent who has had this particular conversation for and knows where it ends. The story reached the internet the way these things do now, fast, sideways, and beyond anyone's ability to manage. By Thursday, a car enthusiast blog had published a piece with details more accurate than Cordelia's communications team was comfortable with. It quoted a former colleague of Beckett's from his Michigan years, who described him as the kind of engineer who understood failure before it happened, which was not quite a compliment, but was entirely true. By the weekend, the piece had been picked up by 2 national outlets and a television segment was being planned without anyone asking him. Beckett read the original blog post at Cordelia's kitchen counter on a Friday morning, sitting across from her with his coffee. He read it once through. Then he folded his hands around the mug and said nothing. Does any of it bother you? She asked. He thought about it honestly. The parts about Ada, he said. The parts that make the last 7 years sound like something I endured rather than something I chose. Were they something you chose? He looked out the window at the property. Most of it, he said. The parts that mattered. Cordelia set down her coffee. She had run her company for 18 years. She had made clear-eyed assessments of many talented people across a long career. She was not usually wrong about what she was looking at. I'd like to talk about what might be possible, she said. Not today. Not here. She glanced toward the sitting room where Ada was ostensibly reading. When we have more time. From the sitting room, I'm reading. You haven't turned a page in 11 minutes, Beckett said. A pause. Some pages take longer. He looked at Cordelia. The corner of his mouth moved in the direction of a smile without fully arriving, just indicating where one would be, if he let it. She does that, he said. I noticed, Cordelia said. She's usually faster, he said. She's listening to us talk about her, Cordelia said. She does that too, he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not an apology, something he was quietly proud of. Cordelia looked at the window. Outside, the October morning was doing what Tennessee mornings do in fall, turning the light flat and deliberate and gold, making everything look briefly like it carried more weight than usual, or perhaps exactly the weight it had always carried, depending on how honestly you were looking. One more thing, she said. What was his name? Your wife. What was her name? Beckett looked at her, the expression of someone who has been asked a question they didn't expect and didn't know they needed. Colleen, he said. Her name was Colleen. That's a good name, Cordelia said. He looked down at his coffee for a moment. She would have had very specific opinions about this car, he said. She had strong opinions about everything orange. Good or bad opinions about orange. Depended entirely on the context. The almost smile again, arriving a little further this time. She would probably have approved of this particular orange. Cordelia nodded. Then she said, My father's name was Walter, in case you were going to ask. Beckett looked at her. People don't always give you that without being asked. I've noticed people step around the name, like saying it costs something. It doesn't, he said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He was quiet a moment. Walter would have loved to hear that engine, he said. Yeah, she said. He would have. The kitchen held that quietly. Ada appeared in the doorway with her book closed, assessing the room the way she assessed most things, directly, without pretense. Can we stay for lunch? She asked. If Ruth's making something, Beckett said. Ruth's always making something, Cordelia said. Ada nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back into the sitting room. Beckett watched the empty doorway for a moment after she was gone, with the expression of a man who has built his life around one person and knows it, and has decided that is not a small thing, but a large one. The Charger sat in its bay the rest of that morning, engine now cool and patient. It had a new ground path, period-correct wiring where the insulation had failed across 40 years of heat cycling in an engine bay nobody had looked at closely enough. It had, for the first time in as long as anyone could say with certainty, everything it was supposed to have and nothing it wasn't. Cordelia drove it the following Saturday, not in the driveway, not in a parking lot, on the road above the property where the cedars opened onto long straightaways and the curves came fast and the grade dropped away toward the valley. She had asked Beckett to come. He sat in the passenger seat and said very little, which was the right amount. She went carefully at first, getting the measure of it. The steering communicated through the wheel in a way that modern cars, padded with electronics and safety systems, never quite managed. The engine responded immediately, without the delay she was used to, like an instrument tuned to a very high standard and waiting to be played at that standard. When she reached the long straightaway above the lake, she gave it room. Not recklessly. Deliberately, with her full attention, the way her father had never let himself drive it, the way he had saved and protected and covered and planned for and never quite arrived at. The engine opened up into something that was enormous and physical and not embarrassed about either. There it is, Beckett said quietly. She knew what he meant. She thought about Walter Ashton at 63, driving home from Columbus with both hands on the wheel, covering the car with a cloth that first night and smoothing it at the edges. She thought about the folder on his kitchen table, the printouts and the clippings and the small essays in his handwriting. All those years of wanting something and being very careful not to use it. He was afraid of breaking something he loved, she said. Beckett looked out the passenger window at the hills. That sounds familiar. I used to think he meant the car. A silence. He meant you, Beckett said. Not a question, just a thing he understood and said. She felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected to be reached. I know, she said. She drove. The road curved back toward the hills, and she stayed in it, and the Charger did what it had been built to do in 1969, which was to move through the world with a completeness of purpose that left nothing in reserve and nothing held back. Her father had spent years being careful with it. She was going to use it. That was the thing he hadn't been able to give himself, and she could give herself instead, and give it to him in the way the living give things to the dead, not as symbol but as action, by doing the thing fully and in the world, by letting the engine run and the tires find the road and the speed build until the car was finally, completely, entirely what it had always been. She held the straightaway for 20 seconds. Then she brought it back down, easy, and drove the rest of the road home with the windows open and the smell of cedar coming through, and the October light doing its honest work on the hills. When they got back to the estate and she cut the engine in the bay, the silence that settled was different from the silence that had lived in that garage for 4 years. Fuller. Less like an absence and more like a room that had been aired out and opened after a long time closed. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without getting out. "Thank you," she said. "You already thanked me," Beckett said. "I mean it differently now than I did then." He waited. "Before," she said, "I meant thank you for solving the problem. Now, I mean," she looked at the steering wheel, "thank you for understanding what the problem actually was. Because I don't think you treated it like a broken car. I think you treated it like what it was." He was quiet a moment. "I knew what it was before I started," he said. "You told me. 5 years, $6 million, 11 teams. Nobody does that for a car. They do that for something else that a car is holding." She nodded. They got out. The bay was warm. She leaned against the car and looked at it from the outside for a long moment. The orange, the black interior, the flying buttress windows. All of it exactly as her father had described it from a kitchen table in Kentucky to an 11-year-old who had not yet understood what it meant to love something you were afraid to use. She understood it now. She was not going to do it that way. Ada appeared in the side doorway with her Carnotaurus sketchbook. She looked at the car, then at her father, then at Cordelia. "Did it go fast?" she said. "Yes," Cordelia said. Ada considered this. "I want to learn how the engine works," she said. "Not just what it does, how it actually works." She looked at Beckett. "Will you teach me?" "Some of it," he said. She turned to Cordelia. "Will you teach me the parts he doesn't know?" Cordelia looked at this 9-year-old in her lopsided ponied tail, holding a sketchbook full of dinosaurs beside American muscle cars, asking a question with the unself-conscious certainty of a person who has not yet learned that this is not how you talk to adults you've just met. "Yeah," Cordelia said. "I will." Ada nodded. "Good." She tucked the sketchbook under her arm. "Can we eat now?" Ruth said something about soup. They went inside. Behind them, the Charger sat in its bay in the late afternoon, hemi-orange, holding the last of the October light, warm from the road, cooling slowly in the quiet. It had been under a cover for 4 years. It had been silent for longer than that. It was neither of those things now. It had been driven. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point, from the moment a man in Middlesbrough put a clipping in a folder and started writing in the margins. Not to preserve something perfect, but to use something real, fully, without holding back. The way all beautiful things deserve to be used when you are lucky enough to have them in your hands.